So here's a little question for you. When we think about safety, whose job is it to keep you safe? Safety has become this huge issue in our time. Of course, since the pandemic hit, it's really been hit. But even before that, back when 2001, 9/11 happened, and then there was a sense of, well, we need safety, and there's been all the various other little mini pandemics or epidemics, or there's been other little mini terrorist attacks, or even just crime in the streets and so on. And there's this obsession that seems to have been growing over the course of my life since I was a kid. It's just interesting to see how the obsession with the safety, public safety, seems to have grown and grown and grown, right? There's this idea. And so now, since the last little while, since COVID hit and so on, we hear this phrase a lot about keeping the public safe, keeping you safe, and you need to do this, and you need to do that, and you need to obey this and do that, whatever. And so, just to be clear, my point here today isn't to say that anything in particular is wrong or right. My point here today is just to simply explore this question, because it's actually a difficult question. Whose job is it to keep you safe? There's sort of two extremes on this, right? There's one group that would say that, for instance, is the government's job or the health authority's job, or it's a restaurant owner's job or a university's job or a store owner's job to keep you safe. And then to some degree it's your job to keep other people around you safe. So you have an obligation to do this or do that to keep others safe. So there's this one sort of end of the spectrum out here that would say it's absolutely the job of some authority. And then there's this other end of the spectrum that says it's totally not. It's totally your job to keep you safe, and it's all it rests totally on your shoulders to keep yourself safe, and it's up to you, and no one else has any part of this. It's just up to you to keep yourself safe. And both of those things have some wisdom to it, and so that's what makes this all difficult. It's not easy to answer that question. I mean, on the one hand, who says it's some authority's job to keep you safe? And if you go too far with that, you get this authoritarian, totalitarian world that's pretty dystopic. It's pretty awful. Like, it's really not a good thing. To sort of use a smaller version of that, imagine a parent who thinks it's his job to keep his child from ever having anything unpleasant ever happen to it. Well, that child will be so smothered by that parent, it becomes very dysfunctional and unhealthy for their life. Codependency develops and all sorts of other things. Well, that's one extreme of that authoritarian view. But the other view is also bad, because a person who says you're totally responsible for your own safety, well, imagine a world where no one cares about you and it's only up to you, and you have to if you can't protect yourself, sir, tough luck, right? Imagine a world so Darwinian that only the strong survive, because only those that are able to protect themselves get to protect themselves. That's a pretty awful world. That's a pretty chaotic, very unsafe place to be, where might makes right. It's terrible. And so you get these two extremes that are both really bad. Where do we come in the middle? How do we understand this? In the middle, it's hard to answer. I mean, we could ask the question of other things. Whose job is it to keep you safe? It's an interesting question, but whose job is it to keep you clean? Who should say that? Should there be some sort of a responsibility on a restaurant owner to make sure all of his people that come into his restaurant, that everybody washes their hand before they eat their meal? Is that his job, or is it your job to wash your hands before you eat your meal? Well, I would argue it's probably your job to do that, but it's probably the restaurant owner's job to make sure his cook washes his hands before he prepares your meal. So I don't know. It's hard, isn't it? Like, whose job is it to feed you in the first place? Is it your job to prepare your meals, or is it somebody else's job to make sure that you have meals to eat? Like, do you go to work so that you can have money to buy food, and that's your responsibility? Or is it the responsibility of the government to feed you whether you go to work or not? Make sure you have food, even if you're just a lazy slob who sits on a couch all day long. Which is it? I mean, I think it's not the job of the government to just feed you, but at the same time, we don't want people starving because they couldn't feed themselves. That's hard, isn't it? Whose job is it to pick your clothes out in the morning? When you're young, it's your parents' job. When you're older, it's your wife's job, or whatever the case is, right? I mean, it's a hard question. It really is actually a hard question. So here's the thing. It's a little bit of both. This is my argument today, something for you to think about today. I think it's a little bit of both. I think that when the nation endures a huge external threat beyond the abilities of an individual, we need authority. And I think God expects authority to step in to some degree and provide some level of safety for the common good. But at the same time, you're not free from obligation. You yourself and the government shouldn't overstep its bounds, right? There should be a certain responsibility on the individual to do things to keep himself safe. There's a mix here of some sort, and we can't put it too much on either. There's a little bit of both. So there's a place in the scripture that actually is similar, where it talks in Ezekiel chapter 33, and the first 5 verses in particular, and I'm not going to read them, I'm just going to paraphrase them here for you today, but you can check them out. The first 5 verses of Ezekiel 33, it gives us this thing where God says to the people, Israel, talking to Israel, he says, Israel, if you set up a watchman in your city, whose job it is basically to look out and warn you if danger is coming. So say a nation is coming with the sword to kill. And so he watches on the city walls and he sees the danger coming. He's then supposed to blow the trumpet, and then everybody is supposed to do what they need to save themselves. So you see this mix, right? You see this idea that there's the society's authority put up, the person who has the authority to blow this trumpet in warning, and then the job of the individual people to care for their needs so that they can protect themselves. So there's this sort of cooperation between the individual and the authority. And what God says is if the watchman does his job, if he blows the trumpet and you die by the sword, it's your own fault. It's not the fault of the watchman. He's not responsible to keep you safe. Right? You are. But at the same time, if he doesn't blow his trumpet and you die, then that's his fault, because he actually had an obligation to warn you and keep you, in a sense, safe from that danger, to be aware that the danger exists in the first place. And so there's this mix where God says the watchman's job is to warn, your job is to act. And that mix and that blend is the thing. And I would say in our society, and I would encourage any politician or any authority figure anywhere that's listening to this, just to think about this. There's a blending that has to happen where the powers that be and the people that be need to work together in a way that is mutually beneficial so that we can keep each other safe and keep ourselves safe. There's a very fine line between a castle and a prison. They both look the same. They both have walls, they both have towers, they both have guards. But one keeps people prisoner while the other keeps people safe. One, you can come and go. The other, you are staying where you are. You got to figure out, how do we make a castle and not a prison? And for all of you who have a side on this, an opinion on this, my job today is just to make you think about it and to realize it's not an easy question. So let's have a little grace for each other as we all try and figure this out, and we all try to come to some sort of reasonable place and reasonable responsibility. Something to think about today.